It seems to me that the PBS has gone through a remarkable structural transformation. I mean, compared to what it looked like 10 or 15 years ago, it's a completely different system these days. And consumers don't see it in a lot of ways, but you working in it, you see that this system, it didn't grow for 5 years, it had an enormous amount of money pulled out of it. Now all of a sudden you've got these hepatitis C medicines and the way they're being priced and the way they're being paid for, and it's difficult to discern exactly what's going on. Maybe it was unpredictable, the structural transformation. So looking ahead 5 years, what do you want the system to look like? So as the government goes into the 7th CPA, and we have to assume there will be one, what do you want wholesaling to look like?
Well, whatever it looks like, it needs to have a sustainable funding model for the wholesalers, right? And I guess as part of our submission to the panel, we've said that needs to include some sort of floor mechanism, so an equivalent of the handling fee that pharmacies got to recognise there is a minimum level of remuneration that we need moving forward. So whatever that model looks like going forward, it has to have some element of that to recognise the overall returns that we require. It's an interesting debate about things like Hep C, right? Because on one front you could say, well, the PBS has been relatively static, and all of a sudden you have things like Hep C spring up as a sort of a spike in spending. Now, it's two things to think about there. One, there'll be a level of rebates provided by the Hep C providers back to the government, so the headline PBS growth will be nothing like the actual underlying growth, and in this case it'll be really, really significant. I think the other point that gets forgotten, and I'm sure the government's thinking about this, is the savings in other parts of the healthcare system. So it's not just about the PBS piece. There'll be potentially eradicating Hep C, or at least reducing the incidence significantly in the community, has an enormous benefit in other parts of the healthcare system. So just focusing on it solely from an impact on PBS, that when you strip those things out, has sort of disappeared back to a two-speed one, where you've got all of the older drugs plummeting in price, right, and all the new drugs taking longer to get there, and they're generally more expensive, and for us, therefore, as a remuneration proposition, less effective.
Someone said to me that drugs these days, old drugs are cheap as chips, and I said, I actually don't. I think they're much cheaper than chips, aren't they? I mean, some of the prices are so low. I mean, is it now? There seems to have been some acknowledgement of that recently. So the system appears to be showing that it can respond to unsustainably low prices. But do you is that what you see?
I think when we try to walk forward, we first need to acknowledge that any change in the industry has a knock-on consequence elsewhere. So when we think about what might our businesses look like, or my business look like in 5 years' time, first I need to have a view on whether the structure we know, the community pharmacy structure we have today, would be the structure in place in 5 years' time. Will pharmacies be owned by pharmacists? Now, while ownership is not a topic for the review, it is spoken about ad nauseum around the review. So if community pharmacists are still the owners of pharmacy in Australia in 5 years' time, then a wholesale model makes perfect sense. It's very, very hard for small business operators to deal with a corporate retail type of supply chain. So multiple parties delivering into a small business is, in my view, unsustainable. So let's assume we have community pharmacies owned by individuals and similar ownership rules in place. Then what we've argued for is that falling prices is good from a government point of view. Let's get the cost of drugs down. Great idea. Nobody would argue with that. But let's acknowledge that at some point, to move all of those products around at the same standard, you need to put an economic return on the table for competitors to get in and fight for that money. And we've argued for a floor in the pricing to come in. Without boring people on the details, at some point, as the price of a drug falls, the available wholesale return needs to be pegged so it doesn't keep dropping away. Because if they're cheaper than chips, we don't really make a cent out of doing it, and we'd stop doing it at some point. So a fundamental argument is...
Your investors will demand that one. I mean, I would imagine that they'll start asking questions.
But what we can't forget here is that we're invested in community pharmacy, And it's not just about the returns we get for shareholders, it's about the impacts that flow on to our pharmacists and our, you know, the people that we support at a day-to-day level. So if we have a situation where we're continuously passing on fees and economic adjustments, that's not good for community pharmacy, and we've reached that point. We've clearly reached that point. And so the model now needs to take account of the fact that whilst we may be able to get to a point where as wholesalers we can make adequate returns, we need to ensure that our pharmacists, our customers, our lifeblood are also viable and sustainable into the future. I think that's absolutely critical, and it gets lost at times because what happens is the argument gets divided up into the wholesale piece or the pharmacist piece, and in the end they're all interlinked.